expands the notion of the self. She says in a democratic society, you, as part of we the people, your self gets expanded to a larger and larger group because your self-interest becomes tied with the larger group. And she says, we Latter-day Saints are among the world's most enthusiastic when it comes to expanding our personal liabilities by expanding the size of the body to which we belong. We energetically undertake the distance and death-defying project of sealing families together, uniting not only parents and children, but also spouses, great uncles, and cousins from Canada to Colombia. We send out tens of thousands of missionaries speaking languages, including Ilocano, Indonesian, and Italian, to invite people to join us in covenants that not only reach upward to heaven, but also outward as we shoulder the burdens of our fellow beings. The global burdens we are hastening to bear include poverty, violence, corruption, materialism, and popular falsehoods. The Latter-day Saint self extends beyond national boundaries, beyond types of physical bodies, and includes sisters and brothers through all generations and through all the earth. And she notes that this is why, though we might have differing views about immigration policy, we don't scoff at refugees or engage in racist denigration of immigrants from other countries, any more than we would scoff at Mary and Joseph in Egypt or denigrate the Savior when he comes to us as a stranger. This is why, though we may have differing views of social policy or tax policy, we do not dismiss whole groups of people as inherently villainous or evil. Are all of God's children really endowed with dignity and holiness or not? It's a pretty stark question, but I think she's right to put it in those terms, to note how expansive our politics need to be in conception, if not in practice all the time. Finally, and I sort of mentioned this before, we have restoration scriptures and recent history of conflict and reconciliation with governments. We have, of course, in the New Testament, the record of Christ's people trying to figure out how to live as citizens in conquered Roman territory, and what that meant, and what it meant to go out and do missionary work and deal with various governments as Christians. But we have this much more recent and much better documented history to look at those kinds of conflicts and reconciliations. So those are some of the principles that I think underlie these articles. Although in good Mormon fashion, I think they're much more about practice and application than underlying principle, because Mormons like to get to work quickly. Latter-day Saints like to get to work quickly.
TCOMs.
So,
TCOMs,
speaking of sort of ways that we engage with politics, these essays all are thinking about political processes, not just personalities and policies. In my work on Eugene England, one of his essays that doesn't make it very much into my book, but is one of my favorites. It's called Why Some Utah Mormons Should Become Democrats.
She wrote a book on Eugene
just
England.
to give it away, give the whole ball game away in the title. And he
What's the name
he
of it?
Notes that in the early
just his
days
name.
of statehood,
England?
just before or just
Yeah,
after
it's in the
statehood,
title,
most Latter-day Saints were drawn to one party, and leaders of the church saw very clearly that that Utah needed to be a two-party state, or else the Latter-day Saints' interests couldn't be adequately represented. And so what England says is that the way that we could have a productive sort of two-party politics among and between Latter-day Saints, as well as with our neighbors, is that we need to think about processes and foundational principles rather than trying to legislate the content of behavior. So his idea is that government should preserve the maximum possible liberty for individuals in areas of moral choice, which fits with how we understand God to deal with his children. So England says that we ought to focus on the process and make sure that there's not corruption and that people are voting and represented, and also that there are checks and balances built into every kind of system at the state and local levels as well as at the national level. And I think that idea comes through in a lot of this, in a lot of these articles, particularly President Oakes's address, which he gave at the University of Virginia last October, I think. So many of you will have seen it in other places. It was published, I think, or at least excerpts in the Deseret News and in other places. So you may have read it. But he, I think it's a remarkable article in which he describes a real change in his approach to understanding political differences. He talks about trying to maintain our religious notions about marriage and family while also coming to recognize the critical interest that LGBTQ members of our church and our society have in not being discriminated against in housing or employment and those kinds of things, and recognizing that there's something like a balancing test that you have to do between religious freedom on the one hand and non-discrimination on the other hand. And I think that is a different way, or at least it's articulated in a way that seemed new to me. And so he's talking very much about process there and about how to practically negotiate those kinds of differences. Judge Tom Griffith also talks about process, although he is, of course, speaking about judicial process rather than legislative negotiation. Susan Madsen also talks about process when in her article, which is encouraging Latter-day Saint women to run for office and be actively involved in politics, and noting the now abundant research that shows that organizations of all kinds do better when there are more women and more various perspectives and styles of working represented in those groups. Let's see. And then maybe this is a point to talk a little bit about the organization Mormon Women for Ethical Government, which co-sponsored this issue, and there are 2 articles in the middle of it about how it got started. You can see Charlie Glenn's article, Women of Faith Speak Up and Speak Out, the Genesis and Philosophical Underpinnings of Mormon Women for Ethical Government. And then Jen and Emma's article, which really talks a lot about the organization and about how they view the role of this nonpartisan organization in engaging with the American political landscape. They are also focused on process and on the structure of the organization. So they've tried very hard to build a collaborative kind of governing structure for the organization. So rather than an organizational chart that is hierarchical, with 1 or 2 directors at the top and then various sub groups underneath, they use the model of a tree. So the trunk of the tree is the let's see. I always have trouble with this metaphor. I was not there at the conception. So the trunk is the day-to-day operations. It's the people who do our graphic design and our volunteer coordination and just sort of keeping the organization running. So they're mostly inward facing. The limbs are outward facing. So we have an engagement limb, empowerment. You'll have to read the book, the article. You can access the articles, by the way, for free on the BYU Studies website. So you don't have to buy the book and make Ross sell books. So anyway, you can look and see that tree if you want to. And then the roots are spiritual, peaceful, nonpartisan, and proactive. So those are spiritual, peaceful. Oh, yeah, those are the four. Sorry. So those are the deep underlying principles that inform all of the work of the rest of the tree, and we try to sort of steer things. So with this sort of unusual organizational chart and a very collaborative governing structure, they want to work in ways that are comfortable for Latter-day Saint women who don't necessarily have a lot of experience in politics and maybe are a little more conflict averse than some other people who don't quite know how to get involved. And their vision is that the organization should model good government and model what we think it might look like in the broader world if we were collaborating healthfully. Let me just read a little bit from that article so you can get an idea of sort of what they're up to. Bridging the gap between our current political reality and the lofty goals of Zion will require many laborers with a diverse array of perspectives and skills. Our organizational efforts are focused on building a society in which the women of our faith are able to participate in impactful ways alongside their fellow citizens. MWAG allows individual women to fulfill their potential and encourages the unique contributions that women can make to the common good. Our objectives are political, but our process is rooted in personal change. It won't be possible to develop a new kind of political engagement without defining and supporting a new pattern of citizenship. So that's one way of thinking about process, is sort of trying to embody it in this organization that started as essentially a Facebook group. A bunch of women who were distraught about the 2016 election got together to talk, and at first it was 5 people, and within a week it was over 1,000 people, and within a month it was approaching 4,000. So it turned out that there were a lot of people who wanted to talk, and Charlie and Linda and Melissa Dalton Bradford and Diana Hardy wanted to turn that energy into more than talk. And so this organization that has been built out from that in the form of a tree is trying to take that energy and intelligence of Latter-day Saint women and give it some channels and skills, just to build skills in women so that they can go out and work in their communities on causes that they feel called to. So the organization itself doesn't take a lot of policy positions, although we have taken some, and we will occasionally issue a call to action to invite our members to write to their representatives. But hopefully what the organization does is to empower women so that they can be involved in good work wherever they are and whatever calls to them the most. Okay, so another kind of practice that really comes through in several of these articles is it's about words and the power of words in the political arena. So there's a lot about careful and charitable reading and likening scriptures to ourselves. Also careful writing and maybe most importantly, careful speaking with our neighbors and in political contexts, that there's so much poisonous language out there that Latter-day Saints really have a duty and have the skills to speak publicly in ways that are constructive and charitable. So there are a couple of articles that mention reading. Melissa Bradford's article on German history and the post-World War II denazification of Germany and how they learned to deal with rather than just ignore the horror in their history, is really about how we read history, what we read into it, what we do with history, how we create for ourselves a usable past that will give us things to work with. Elder Uchtdorf's talk that he let us republish is also about some of that same history and how it can inform the ways that we behave in the future. Robert Schwartz's article, is about how we read the Book of Mormon. That he notes that we have come to read the Book of Mormon in some ways that are maybe incorrect, but even more importantly, that are lazy. We have habits of interpretation that get in our way of seeing what's really in the text. And so he argues for more attentive reading with the contemporary issues that we worry about, like economics, in mind. Let me just read a little bit from that because I think it's important. This is his conclusion. He says, reviewing Book of Mormon history through the long view of inequality, privilege, and the narrative surrounding each demands a relearning of the lessons that it has to teach. Readers see distinct periods that might not have been as clear before. There are the initial founding events in Lehi's family. Years of separation and inequality ensue, owing to blindness, extractive institutions, and divergent narratives that are sometimes at odds with the stated intentions of the respective parties. King Benjamin shatters old mindsets, realigning Nephite culture and changing Nephite distributional preferences through education combined with a social pact. Actions by Mosiah, Alma, and others who apply his teachings begin to create inclusive institutions and pockets of equality and peace amid extremely chaotic circumstances over decades. Jesus Christ eventually appears to the Book of Mormon peoples, and a long period of equality and peace follows. After centuries, old evils reappear, and the ancient societies quickly descend into chaos and violence that prove to be their end. Redemption is possible. Prejudice, racism, discrimination, populist appeals, murder, revenge, and destruction are also possible. What will the reader choose? And so I like the way that he, simply by sort of reading carefully and doing some new periodization of the Book of Mormon history largely around economic issues, but not entirely, just cracks the text open enough for us to see it in a different way. So that's another important kind of reading as political practice. Tom Griffith, of course, talks about reading the law and Constitution. Those of you who know Judge Griffith's work will know that he is he cares deeply about the text and would describe himself, I think, as a textualist, and wants to interpret precisely what is there and no more and no less. And so he's talking about a very particular kind of reading that has to be done with the law. Ed Carter's article about journalism is mostly about writing, but it has a little bit about reading, but it's a good transition into how we write. And Ed takes some of Todd Christofferson's 2017 speech and to, I think, the National Press Club. I think that's where he gave it. Sorry, I've
Several.
lost a few details.
Hand me that.
But he goes through that speech and talks about sort of the duties of journalists and of those of us who consume media to think carefully about what fair
No, we're good here.
and intelligent journalism is. And he reads that very much as a duty of Latter-day Saints to think hard about how we read the newspaper.
Unfortunately.
And how, for those of us who write things, how we write. Charlie Glenn's article also talks a lot about writing, because at the beginning of MWEG, what they mostly did was to write official statements. They were responding and trying to find language for their thinking about the election, and hopefully provide language to people who hadn't yet articulated their own thoughts the way that they would want to, and to spur more thought. Jen and Emma also talk about that, and just as an editor, I can tell you that
No, they were all Democrats who were unhappy.
They did their writing in the same way as they try to run the organization. At first, Jen and Emma had tried to write something, and it was by themselves, and it was terrible. It was just overwritten, kind of maudlin. It was just bad, and they knew it was bad, but they didn't know what to do about it, and I didn't really know what to do about it either, until Jen had the idea that it needed more voices. And so they quickly sent some questions to the 100 or so core volunteers in the group, and started seeing what they said about what MWEG is doing. And the article came together very quickly, because by then they were many weeks past the deadline. And but it came together quickly as soon as they realized that writing is a process that you do in ways that are ethical and relational, as well as just technical and intellectual. And then there are several who talk about speaking. I don't want to steal Ross's thunder, but I think you may hear from Kristine Hansen at some point about what Latter-day Saints as citizen rhetors or rhetor. I don't even know how to pronounce the word. The root of rhetoric, rhetors, I guess, a noun form of that, and how Latter-day Saints can begin to think and speak in ways that are considered and deliberate, that we use language in ways that are not manipulative, but are intended to, or not manipulative, but conscious of their effect on an audience, and that we think carefully about the ways we speak. Let me see if I can find a good paragraph from her. We have an obligation to do all we can to improve the quality of political rhetoric in the United States and in other nations today. As citizens, we can do much, even if we don't hold elected office, to reach out to our friends, neighbors, family members, and fellow citizens, to engage them in dialogue about political matters that will help lower the temperature in our overheated, distrustful, and polarized environment. Our numbers are small, but Christ has called the members of his kingdom, his church, to be the salt of the earth and the leaven in the loaf. A little salt goes a long way to flavor a pot of soup, just as a little yeast can make several loaves of bread rise. As disciples of Christ, we must see to it that we are using our small strength to do great things, even in the world of politics. So finally, a theme that runs through all of these articles in different ways is basically that living as Latter-day Saints is the way that we learn to be the kinds of citizens that our nations need. So self-discipline. Melissa Inouye, in her article, notes that Mormons are famous for our discipline in matters of what we eat and drink and watch on TV and are willing to say, yeah, that there are many ways in which we are notable for self-discipline. And she suggests that we also can become self-disciplined in expanding our self to include all of those people that we are covenanted with. We also know something as Latter-day Saints about active love of neighbors, not just, feeling things for them, but doing things for people and loving across ideologies. That's one of the beauties of Latter-day Saint Ward, is that we are brought into contact with people who we wouldn't necessarily seek out, who might disagree with us. It's very easy in America to never encounter anyone that you have profound disagreements with, really, in person. You can certainly manage not to ever get assigned to bring a casserole to someone that you disagree with fiercely if you wanted to. And that's one of the great lessons that we have in the church, is how to actively love those with whom we share only small elements of our thought. And then finally, we ended with Jessica Priest's beautiful article or essay on the discipline of hope. And she talks about hope, not as sentiment, but as action and as discipline, because it's so easy to become cynical, to just say it's all corrupt, there's nothing we can do, and to just start to look with that despairing or sneering, or both, eye at our neighbors, instead of continuing to hope against hope, as Abraham. Paul tells us that Abraham hoped against hope, and so we ended with her admonition to hope. I'm going to end talking about Linda's cover art for the issue. I'm going to, maybe, if I'm very smart, move to it on my screen. So you can't see it too well, and if I blow it up, it gets too blurry. But you can see that it's quilt. Linda is an excellent quilter, does beautiful work all the time, and we had thought that maybe that one of her quilts would be a good image as a cover, because it says a lot about who Latter-day Saint women are and what we do and have done throughout our history. And so she got some fabric that she liked and was starting to design the quilt. And then she fell and broke her wrist, and knew that she wouldn't be able to sew a quilt by the time we needed to have the art. And she couldn't even use scissors. And so her visiting or her ministering sisters came over and helped cut squares. Her husband helped her come up with the idea of gluing the blocks to a big, huge foam board instead of sewing them together, since she couldn't sew. And so they all did. They got together and cut the pieces out and lined them up. And Linda spent a few days gluing, because that was what she could do. And I love this as a metaphor for how we get involved in our community. We think we have a plan. We have some ideals about what our government should be like. We may start to work, and then, something goes wrong, and we can't do it by ourselves. And it feels like in this very fractured moment in our politics, we have more than just a broken wrist. There are multiple fractures and contusions in our society. And I love this image because it's diverse. The things don't seem to fit together necessarily until it's all bound in she chose John Lewis's words about good trouble, getting in good trouble, that being involved in government and is always going to be trouble, but that's good. And let me just finish with her. She wrote about the process of making this art, and her conclusion is beautiful, and I'm going to steal it and stop there. She says, I spent let's see, when I had a pattern that pleased me visually, I was delighted with the jarring juxtapositions. The peace dove right next to military insignia and bombs, crowns and armor of the ancient realms near the flags of modern nations, maps budding hearts to represent all the skin tones of the world. How does this assemblage not just burst into flames from all the contrasts and conflicts? It does not catch fire because it, symbolically at least, is bound by human hearts dedicated to the hard work and necessary wrestles of what John Lewis referred to as good trouble, necessary trouble. Unless we imagine that the trouble we go through to make government good will end up being tidy and orderly, there's the image on the back cover, which I don't know if you can see it. It's just some scraps. And she says, it's a reminder. This is a work in progress. It is all hands on deck. It is constant and ongoing. All the scraps, disarray, and chaos can only succeed if there is an undercurrent of love, cooperation, commitment, and hard work woven into the ongoing process. Stop there and see what questions you have. I'll stop sharing my screen too, so that I can see the chat.
Wonderful introduction to a great volume that, again, I recommend to everybody. Not only this, but the regular editions of BYU Studies. I have a couple questions to start out with. You didn't mention anything about in whose memory this edition was created. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that, which I think is fascinating?
Yeah, it was not, that was a little bit accidental. He died as we were working on it. And there were some other people, not us, at BYU Studies who thought that it would be appropriate to have an obituary or a memorial. So that was actually not our choice. And we worried about it a little because we feared that it would seem partisan, but we've managed to offend everyone pretty much equally with this issue, I think. And so it turns out that was all right. So
you didn't mention the
name. It's Harry. It was Harry Reid. There's a brief tribute to him at the beginning.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful introduction, frankly. Several of you commented early on, did I watch the funeral service for Harry Reid? And I didn't. I caught a little bit of it on the replay, but what an interesting life he lived, and a different perspective that most of us had realized. We thought of him as Mr. Democrat, and yet it was President Russell M. Ballard who spoke at his funeral, calling Harry Reid a dear friend, a man of faith in word and deed, and a devoted member of the church whose bishop recommended him as the best minister in the ward. Boy, what an accolade. Wouldn't anybody just love to have somebody say that about them at their funeral? I'm telling you, that's just pretty amazing. The bishop, he's the best minister in the ward.
Yeah, and he's an example of someone who I think was in good trouble everywhere he went, right? He was a good minister in his ward, but his ward members did not always appreciate him. They mostly did not share his politics, and then within the Senate, he also was in trouble, but I think tried hard to live as a Latter-day Saint among the senators and be kind and have, to cultivate relationships that crossed ideological boundaries. That was also evident in his funeral.
Another question I wanted to ask you, but where is the quilt now?
I think it's at Linda's house. And it's a little bit sad because her wrist is all healed and she could sew again, but it's glued to foam board. So I don't think she has plans to take it apart and re-glue it. But yeah, maybe we will have maybe someday MWEG will have an office and it will be displayed there or something. I don't know.
I always like to tell you a little bit about Bainbridge Island, but Bainbridge Island, among the artworks that we have in our building, is a magnificent quilt that was sewed by our Relief Society representing women of all the world. And it's well worth visiting our Bainbridge Island, if only to see the quilt in the Bainbridge Island Ward building that the sisters built some time ago, over 20 some years ago. It's great. It's behind the plexiglass. Wonderful.
favorite
Looks like I'm
traditions
getting a
of
good video
Mormon women. I think quilts are
because
beautiful
the
and
angle of that
often profound.
cell phone camera has to.
Other questions or comments, please feel free to unmute and ask or speak.
Creates a shadow, a silhouette. If you look at what's coming over on the cell phone, it's looking pretty good.
Looks better than what
I'll just ask you another question that I find fascinating, and you did steal my thunder a little bit. I didn't mind it at all, though. But to your introduction, I've contacted now Kristine Hansen, who has agreed to speak to us. I believe will be the first Saturday in August. She'll speak to us a little bit up in the air right now, but her article to moderate and unify, and this notion of citizen rhetorics like you, I had never heard of the phrase before. I read it, but it's very provocative, and I'd just like to read maybe a little section of it, that kind of a teaser for where we're going and a cap to what you had to say as well. She gives this wonderful example that she's borrowed in part from others, but it's really a center line to her topic, which we're going to hear more about. She says, for example, you might be a white, male, college-educated Republican, member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and find yourself working in a committee with a black, female, high school educated Democratic member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. If you could each set aside your demographic differences, you might find that you share a passion for human dignity and helping the poor escape poverty. When you stop and think about that for a minute, whoa, wouldn't that be something to be able to unify that way? Wonderful. So she tells us a lot, as do many of the other articles, about lowering the temperature of our discourse and looking for ways in which we can moderate. And of course, her notion of that is that you have to be able to give. You have to be able to give up some of your strongly held positions in favor of the greater good, which is the unity for which we all plead. Have any of the other participants who are on the call tonight, just to be a little bit provocative, have you noticed that COVID has caused some disunity? I don't necessarily mean about the political impact of whether we get vaccinated or whether we wear masks, etc., but just the fact that we've been isolated so much for the last couple of years. How has it impacted your unity in your ward? Anybody have any comments with that?
I don't know about my ward so much, but I've worked with interfaith for quite a few years, and I think when we only see each other through Zoom, we begin to see each other as caricatures of ourselves rather than the warmth and nuance and humanness of seeing each other in the flesh. And maybe our social skills have declined a little bit. It's kind of like the difference between seeing a play and reading a play. Seeing a play, the same play may be very drear as a text, but when it's embodied in human life, in human beings, it becomes something forceful and powerful, even if negative. A Mammoth play or something like that is just in text, but can be, and I found that, a matter of fact, I've kind of had a hard year with interfaith because I'm in a leadership position, and I'm really glad to be out of it because I seem to be. I need to read the BYU article to refocus because I'm just kind of burnt out. I don't know. Is that an answer to your question?
It's almost like God was onto something with that whole embodiment thing.
Yes. Funny, how about that?
Yeah.
Other comments or questions? Well, how about your answer to that question, Kristine? Has your ward, have you noticed an impact because of the COVID shutdown?
Well, we moved in the middle of COVID, so I don't have any before COVID to compare it to, and our ward is this just utterly delightful downtown St. Louis ward that is full of medical students and residents who are in the city for a few years, and and then people who've lived in St. Louis forever. It takes in most of the poorest neighborhoods in St. Louis. So I'm trying to think about like sort of what fraction is what. But anyway, we have, temporarily poor graduate students, and we have, generational poverty that is really hard to deal with, and just this glorious, chaos all the time of people trying to help each other, trying to be good to each other, and stepping on toes, but everyone is really forgiving and open. And our ward, sort of alone in our stake, there was really never a problem about masking. We everybody followed the CDC guidelines, and when the bishop said, "Hey, let's mask up," we did. And we had some elderly and some African American brothers and sisters who are at higher risk, and everybody seemed to just take it in stride. And so there's something about a ward where it is really very much about salvation and not about lifestyle that has made it easier somehow. Like no one cares about my politics. I have no idea about anybody else's politics. It just doesn't come up. We're busy. Well, let's see.
I wouldn't want to be
Gil,
inflammatory, but I'd like to know how in the world you
I
can
don't have
oppose the road.
much insight. I would suggest a book by
How you can be in favor of road. How you can be in favor
Quinn
of road.
Monson
It
and
violates all
David
kinds of
Campbell.
freedom
It's
of
probably
individual states to make their
5
own
years old at
decisions.
this
It
point,
makes
but they
the abortion decision
they talk a
needs to
lot
be
about how
legislated, not
how Latter-day Saints politics came to be so skewed. And you're not wrong that they are. At least a few years ago, I think they thought maybe about 17% of Latter-day Saints were Democrats. Elder Faust was a Democrat when he was alive, but that's been a while.
Hugh Brown.
we believe
Yeah,
in
Hugh B.
demo-
Brown.
we believe in
There was a
in
minor kerfuffle
representative form of
last year
government
when
where the people make the choice.
one of Elder Uchtdorf's children, I think, using his account, donated to a Democratic politician. I can't remember if it was Utah or national. I think national. So, there are some, but not very many, for sure. I think sociologists like Armin Moss and historians would locate that shift in, starting with anti-communism in the mid 20th century. Ezra Taft Benson, was not while he was president of the church, but was as an apostle, was a forceful speaker and fairly, I think it's fair to say, extremely right-wing. Extremely zealous in his anti-communism, which landed him in a certain position on the American political spectrum. Outside the U.S., I think it's very different. My dad, when he hears members complaining about socialists and socialism, says, there are a lot of German saints and a lot of people's Scandinavian ancestors who, would be distressed to hear that a good Latter-day Saint can't be a socialist, because they all have been for generations, in various ways. So I suspect it's different, but I don't have much experience or expertise in international Mormonism, so I'm the wrong person to ask. You might look at Laurie Maffley Kipp. She has written about Latter-day Saints in the Pacific Rim, and Melissa Inouye, whose article is the first one in this issue, also has done a lot of writing about Latter-day Saints in mostly in China, and well, not mainland China, but she does a lot of work on that area of the world and on Latter-day Saints in that region. So those are places I would start if I was wanting to get more information.
I'm reminded that you mentioned Armand Mas. I'm reminded several of us have said we wished we would have asked earlier, and when he was still alive, to have him speak at a fireside. But I remember he did a survey of racism way back when, maybe in the 60s or so, and he came to a very happy, unfortunate conclusion. The happy part of the conclusion was that Latter-day Saints were no more prejudiced than any of the other fellows in the Intermountain West. The bad part was we were just as prejudiced as the people in the Intermountain West. So it was kind of an insight.
Maria, President Benson was pretty convinced that, when he was Elder Benson, he was pretty convinced that the civil rights movement was in some way allied with communism. My dad, when they sent Elder Benson to be the European mission president, in part to help the controversies he had stirred up in the United States die down. My dad was his assistant. He was the assistant to the president and spent about a year in the mission office with him. And he has stories that would curl your hair about what President Benson thought. I don't think that it was racial animus. I think sincerely that he believed that it was the anti-communism that drove that more than any particular virulent racism. So I would I don't know, that seems a little bit hopeful to me that it was an ideological rather than racist thing. But let me just read something that is also in Melissa's article, just right after the part that I read, or right before. She said, "We the people, the governors and the governed are one body, not just Labor, Greens, Republicans, or Christian Democrats, nor any sort of identity category. Within a given democratic country and system, all people make up the national self. Supporting harm to or suppression of any group within a national system is self-harm and self-suppression. When the hand gets a wound, we don't ignore it because the feet are fine. In this spirit, President Dallin H. Oaks recently taught, of course, Black Lives Matter. That is an eternal truth all reasonable people should support." That was in a BYU devotional in 2020. So we are getting there slowly, I think. I hope.
Great. Any other questions or comments before we close what's been a very inspirational and informative session?
Racial group.
Well, thank you all for attending tonight. Just a couple of announcements before we wrap up. In terms of where we're going, I mentioned Kristine Hansen will speak to us. I think it's the first Saturday in August. Next week, we'll hear from Ben Spackman. Ben is recommended by a number of you as really an excellent speaker. I've heard him speak in different contexts. He's a PhD candidate in American Religious History at Claremont, and he's looking at, among other things, his dissertation looks at the intellectual roots of LDS creationism and evolution in the 20th century, which will be, I think, an interesting topic. He was involved in a BYU Studies issue involving evolution.
Yeah, Ben's great. I'll just add my endorsement. And
Good.
his dissertation is going to be really important work.
Good. Well, he's going to speak to us here next week. He is now, I understand, the University of Utah's Tanner Fellow for Mormon Studies this year, which is great. So he's going to speak to us about the intertwined histories of evolution and biblical scholarship. Again, with the idea of selling books, I want to tell you Rod Miller, who was on earlier, may still be on earlier. Rod Miller is everybody's favorite Western writer. He's come up with a new one, which is a barn burner entitled All My Sins Remembered. Forget everything you thought you knew about a guy who's an active member of the church who can write about diabolical thinking. And you've got All My Sins Remembered, really a page turner. in terms of a novel about wickedness, but very insightful. And I just read a review of it incidentally. But the review was, as I told Rod, that almost as good as the book. Not quite, but almost as good as the book. So thank you all for attending tonight. Sister Johnson, I asked earlier by chat whether you'd be willing to give us a benediction tonight. I don't know if you've got that, but if you would be willing, would you please signal that you would be and give us a benediction tonight?
Ross, did you want to announce Margaret's summer school?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I do. I did, and I'm glad for that quick reminder here. Jan has put in the chat the information, and incidentally should alert you all to follow along with your chats occasionally. It's a distraction a little bit from the speaker, but there's always some very interesting information. But this is a very timely one. Margaret Barker, who's spoken to us twice, and I've spoken to her about a third speaking engagement with us, holds her annual summer school 2022 on the lead books. This is the subject she talked about earlier with us, and it's going to be from the 9th to the 12th of August in the Moravian Church in Oakbrook, Derbyshire, England. I just can't recommend this enough. I'm glad that you reminded me of this, Jan. We were in the UK here just 3 weeks ago and spent 3 weeks in the UK. And one of the most delightful of all evenings was the evening we spent with Margaret and Richard Barker, where they had us over for dinner, and just symptomatic of everything that's good about these firesides as far as I'm concerned, which includes the friendships that I'm able to make with wonderful speakers, including the one we've heard tonight from Kristine Haglund. So look in the chat for information about it. That is available by Zoom if you're not inclined to travel to Oakbrook, which is a wonderful place. But they're available by Zoom, and you could sign up for it there. Thank you, Jan, for reminding me of that. Valerie Johnson, are you with us tonight? Can you give us?
Yeah. Yes,
Good.
I am. I'd love to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Father in heaven, we come before thee at this time with great humility and respect for those in our faith who learn and research and in turn teach us and edify us and uplift us. We're very grateful for all that we've learned and understood and have been exposed to this evening, that we can expand our minds and be grateful that the glory of God is intelligence. We give thanks again for all of these things and ask that we might spend time thinking in depth about our commitments to ourselves, to our church, to our country, and our families. And we are grateful for those who lead and guide and direct us, and for the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We acknowledge thy hand in all things and do so in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Valerie. And thank you to everyone who attended tonight.
Yes, thank you.
Appreciate your attendance. Thank you, Kristine. Good Sabbath to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.